From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Mark Demunation. I'm Chief of the Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress, and I'm happy to welcome you to the second of 4 sessions devoted to the Thomas Jefferson Library Special Program. The program will work like this. Our speaker will have about 30 minutes to talk, 10 minutes for question and answer. We ask that you come to the microphone when you have a question so that we can record the question as well, and we'll try and keep on time. When a lifelong concern for race relations, which began in her childhood in East Texas, intersected with a Harvard JD and a chosen career in law, Annette Gordon-Reed emerged as a strong critic of American racism and as a powerful proponent for spotlighting African American culture. Her first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, published in 1997, convincingly documented the long supposed affair between Jefferson and Sally Hemings, one of his slaves. It also immediately propelled her to fame as a Jefferson authority and as a participant in what has now been nearly a 20-year conversation about Thomas Jefferson and his attitudes towards race slavery. Gordon-Reed's publications since that moment have looked at the issue of race in America from several perspectives. In 2001, with Vernon E. Jordan, she co-authored his memoir, Vernon Can Read, where she continued to hone an approach that incorporated what she called Black people's input and Black people's participation in American society. She continued in this theme in one fashion or another as the editor of Race on Trial, Law and Justice in American History in 2002, and as a contributor to Jubilee, The Emergence of African American Culture in 2003. But certainly it was with the 2008 publication, The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, that Gordon-Reed rose to national prominence. In this book, she brought new insight into Jefferson's relationship with Hemings and the 7 children he had by her. A narrative that had once been riddled with speculation was now solidified into an actual compelling story that placed Jefferson and Hemings in the social context of their place and time. And for this effort, Gordon-Reed was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award for Nonfiction, and numerous other awards, including ultimately the MacArthur Fellowship or the Genius Award in 2010. This is a finely crafted, highly detailed work that is as provocative as it is persuasive. It raises questions about love, family, and race in the face of a seemingly insurmountable institution. Please welcome Annette Gordon-Reed, who this afternoon will be discussing Jefferson and the Hemingses of Monticello.
Thank you very, very much. It's always good to be back in Washington for the National Book Festival. This is my second time here with the festival. I was also very privileged to participate in an exhibit, as an advisor on an exhibit about Jefferson and his contribution to the Library of Congress. You do know that his books, the books that he sold to the library, formed the core of the library's collection, and we did an exhibit which celebrated the attempt to bring all of his books back to the Library of Congress to try to reconstitute the collection. So I have been back here at the Library of Congress to talk a number of times, so I feel a great kinship with the place. They can't see my face, I'm told. Okay. So it's always a great pleasure to be here with you and to discuss Jefferson. Jefferson is such a multifaceted figure, as you will see today, with the number of people who are on the program, the person who preceded me, the people who will come after me, give different aspects of Jefferson's life and Jefferson's personality and Jefferson's story. My focus has been upon Jefferson and slavery and the question of Jefferson and race and Hemings, and through that to explore basically the foundation of the American nation through Jefferson, because he is seen as someone, rightly and wrongly and fairly and unfairly, as in some ways a personification of America. I am currently finishing a book called Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination, which I see as another iteration of my exploration of Jefferson's life and life at Monticello. After my first book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, which really looked at the historiography of Jefferson and Hemings, how historians had talked about the story, I got the idea that one of the reasons it was so difficult for many people to accept what the Hemingses and other enslaved people at Monticello had to say about life at the plantation and life with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings is that people really didn't know anything about the Hemingses. When people discussed Sally Hemings, they referred to her as a slave girl. When they talked about Madison Hemings, her son, they would refer to him as a slave man or a slave. Are you going to trust this slave who said this? Slaves are always trying to make their situation better, to make their situation look better. And this association with Jefferson was why he claimed falsely that he was the son of Thomas Jefferson. And I was offended by that. Not only because you have a group of people who were the objects of slavery, the objects of this oppression, who were not taken seriously, which seemed to me to be a tremendous moral problem, just as a matter of fact. If you're really interested in history, you want not the story just that you want makes you feel good or happy, but you want the real story. And so if you're looking for that, I thought that all the sort of normal ways that you assess credibility should be applied in this situation, looking at what the enslaved people had to say, looking at what black families had to say about their families, and comparing it to what Jefferson's family had to say and what other whites were saying, and to weigh these two things evenly in the balance. So that's what my first book was really about. I really was not out to prove that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings had a relationship, although I will have to say that I wrote the book chronologically, from the introduction to the end. And if you read the book, you see me getting a bit more convinced as we go along, because the more research I began to do, the more I realized that, wait a minute, there's something to this. And if I were writing the book today, I probably would go back, and any author will tell you this, or most authors will tell you that there would be things that they would do differently. And if I were doing that book today, I would go back and rewrite it and make it more even. You wouldn't see the progression of my thought and so clearly as you see but it was my first book and I was doing the best that I could do. The Hemingses of Monticello grew out of that effort because I thought, well, if you don't know anything about people, it's easy to say things about them if you have no stake in these people. I live in Manhattan, and very often or occasionally I'm introduced to my neighbors, and then I find myself seeing them all the time. Before I'd probably walk past them a million times, never noticed them. But in seeing them, you begin to wonder, if you don't see them after a while, I wonder where this person is. Or if they have kids, you say, I wonder why are the kids not with them now? What is it? What's going on? You have a stake in them and you care about them. So what I wanted to do with the Hemingses of Monticello was to move things beyond an argument and move things beyond a discussion of Tom and Sally. And I have to say, when I first started writing this, I said, I'm not going to spend that much time on Tom and Sally at all, which was crazy, obviously, because she's a pivot in the story. But I was so resentful of the fact that she had sort of taken over the entire story. And I realized that Sally Hemings was an individual, but she was an individual who existed within a context. And it was a context of a family. She was somebody's daughter. She was someone's friend. She was someone's mother. She was someone's aunt and cousin. And she was connected to Jefferson, not just through their one-on-one relationship, but there was a web of relationships that explained what happened there. And unless you bring that entire web into view, you really can't understand the two of them, and you can't understand Jefferson alone. A friend of mine, Virginia Scharf, who wrote a book called The Women Jefferson Loved, the first time I met her, she said something to me that I had always felt, but I had never put it this particular way. She asked a question. She said, what would happen if every single person in Jefferson's life mattered? In other words, if all the people around him were not just pawns, not just sort of window dressing, not just scenery to sort of make him look good, but what if you took all of their lives seriously? What would he look like? And that is what I wanted to try to do with the Hemingses of Monticello, because I was interested in the Hemingses as a family, but I was also, I realized that this was part of a scholarly project that I have, which culminates in a 2-volume biography of Jefferson. The book that I'm talking about that will be out in April is a part of that as well. But to try to understand this particular individual, his relationship to slavery, his relationship to the American nation, and to do that by looking closely at the Hemings family and his connection to them in a way that illuminates their lives, but illuminates his life as well. So for people who don't know, the Hemingses came to Monticello through a marriage. Jefferson married Martha Wales Skelton, a widow who had had a husband briefly who passed away early, as often happened in that time period. Jefferson married her, and she was the daughter of a man named John Wales, who was a wealthy immigrant from England who'd made a name for himself. He brought to this country as a servant. Actually, in other Jefferson biographies, he is described as a person who was trained as a lawyer in England, and I discovered, working on the Hemingses of Monticello, that in fact he was a servant who was brought over. Very big difference between being trained as a lawyer in England and being a servant brought over, which changes your understanding of Martha Jefferson completely, what her life must have been like. But John Wales was very talented. He became a well-known, prosperous lawyer and planter and a slave trader, actually. And he had lots of land and lots of slaves. Jefferson marries into the family, and when John Wales died, Jefferson inherited 135 slaves. Among those slaves were the Hemings family, the matriarch of whom was Elizabeth Hemings, who had become John Wales's concubine, mistress. Perhaps we can talk about, there's a big controversy now because of Julian Bond's death. He mentioned that his great-grandmother was a slave mistress, and the New York Times used that word mistress, which touched off a fury because people thought that that sounded, it sort of played down the implications of sexual relations between masters and slaves. It implied consent. I don't agree with that, but we can talk about that later in the 10 minutes we have left allotted, perhaps. But in any event, she became, in their grandson's words, his concubine after his third wife died, and he had 6 children with him, the youngest of whom was Sally Hemings, actually born Sarah Hemings. So when John Wales dies, they come into the ownership of Thomas and Martha Jefferson, and they move to Monticello, and Elizabeth is there for the next 4 decades, essentially. And one of the reasons I was able to do the Hemingses of Monticello is because Jefferson was an inveterate record keeper, and he kept detailed lists of the farm operations and of the enslaved people on the plantation. Slavery was a business. You keep track of inventory. He had the names and birth dates of the slaves who were born at Monticello and his outlying plantations. So I was able to track the Hemings family through these decades, which is a difficult thing to do for most enslaved people. It's difficult as well because in many instances, after the 1800s and the beginning of the 1800s, when slave owners began to go west, they took slaves with them, and Virginia later in the 19th century becomes a place where the sort of focal point of the internal slave trade. So lots of families were broken up during that time period. The Hemingses, because of their connection to Jefferson, stayed in one place for 5 decades. And you see generation after generation of family pretty much in the same place. And so I was able to reconstruct their lives through Jefferson's records, through some of their own records. Some members of the family were literate, and through the oral history of the Hemings family afterwards. And I understand the problems with oral history, and that it's difficult to keep, it's like playing a game of telephone. One person tells one person something, and by the time it gets around the room, it can be changed quite a bit. If you think of that in terms of across years, stories can be lost. But there are ways to check things. You check things from other records, corroborating evidence. I'm sure anybody who's a genealogist in the room knows how this is done. It is something that genealogists do all the time to try to find things outside of the oral history that support what people are saying. So those kinds of things, all of those different methodologies, this is one of the fun things about doing, slavery and fun, those two words you don't think of them going together, but if you're a detective, which historians must be at some level, you must love doing this kind of thing. I love being in the archive. I love ferreting things out. One of the difficult parts of doing slavery scholarship is piecing those things together, but it's difficult, but it's fun to do. Finding the little things that fit, finding the little things sometimes that don't fit, and that's always a pain when you think you're going down one road and you're sure that you're right, and you hit something that tells you, nah, your understanding of all of this is wrong, you have to go back to the drawing board. But I love that kind of thing, and you have to love that kind of thing in order to do it, and if you're going to do it well, I think that has to be a part of your makeup. So this story was tailor-made for what I like to do and what I've been doing sort of as a hobby most of my life, sort of looking stuff up, piecing things together. And I start off the first section of the book. It's a very long book, but I'm told that it's quite readable. 3 parts of the book. The first part of the book introduces you to the Hemings family, and we get them to Monticello, explain all of the relationships that exist, and the people. There's a family tree, excuse me, that is necessary because everybody has the same name. They're Johns, Marthas, Pollys, Marys, various incarnations of that. So we have a family tree that helps you keep everything together. The first section introduces these people and tells as much as we can the story of Elizabeth Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, and the beginnings of the American Revolution. After the Revolution is successful, Jefferson is called upon to go to France. They had asked him to go previous times, but he was unable to do it because his wife was very sickly. His wife died in 1782. His wife, who, if you're not keen to what I said before, just make it plain, Jefferson's wife was the half-sister of Sally Hemings. So it's one of those sort of Virginia genealogies that there's all mixed up and so forth. And people, I was in England this past year, and I give talks there, and I try to explain this to people. And I get these sort of puzzled looks on their face, like, what? But they had a colonial society, so they're being pretending when they're pretending when they just say they don't when they don't understand all of this. It's feigned ignorance on their part, I think. But twisted genealogy, strange genealogy, and when Martha dies, her sisters and Sally, they're all around the bed, the kind of, bizarre tableau that it's hard for us to imagine, but we know happened. So after Martha dies, the revolution is over, the United States will be the United States and are on their way. Jefferson goes to Paris on a trade mission. He was supposed to go to negotiate the peace treaty, but peace broke out before he could go, and the treaty was signed, so he went to do other things, trade representatives. He eventually succeeds Benjamin Franklin, but he goes to Paris, and he takes with him James Hemings, who is many readers, from letters that I've gotten, probably the people's favorite person in the book, an enormously talented older brother of Sally Hemings, who's taken by Jefferson to France to learn how to become a French chef. Jefferson was a great admirer of French cooking and French wine, so he wanted a French cook at Monticello, so he took James to do this. And James, in the second part of the book, I tell the story of James arriving in Paris. James is sent ahead. He doesn't, as far as I know, he hadn't studied French. Perhaps he did have a few words. Excuse me, I forgot to bring my water up. Thank you very much. Jefferson sends him ahead to make hotel reservations while they're at port. So you get a sense of this young man who is from the middle of nowhere in Virginia, who is suddenly in France, who goes off to negotiate with people to get a hotel room, which he successfully does. He then goes to Paris with Jefferson and begins his training as a chef. He trains in some of the best kitchens in France. Chantilly, the home of a member of the French royal family. Chantilly has this wonderful chateau that had a stable for 287 horses. I mean, it makes Monticello look like a tool shed. And there's, the French, to call Virginians aristocrats. I mean, I'm not cracking on them, but I'm not cracking on them Virginians, but to call them aristocrats and to think about a place like France, that's why they had a revolution. I mean, where they had, the families are 1,000 years old, where there's just like, it's just amazing the difference between rich there and rich here during that time period. And so you think about this young man, I ask you to think of this young man who's been raised to believe that the people who own him are so far above everybody in the world, and then he goes to this place that doesn't have slavery and legalized slavery like that, and to see this opulent world. So this part of the book is about James Hemings. Sally Hemings makes an appearance through this because at some point Jefferson wants his younger daughter, whom he has left with his sister-in-law, who is, in this twisted genealogy, Sally Hemings' half-sister, with his youngest daughter as a companion. And he asks his daughter to be brought over by a middle-aged Negro woman, a careful middle-aged Negro woman who would bring her over. And instead, his in-laws send Sally Hemings, who's 14. And Abigail Adams is aghast. They spend 2 weeks at Abigail Adams' home in London because that's where she was supposed to go. Polly was supposed to go there, and Jefferson would come and pick her up. Jefferson does not go pick her up. He sends his servant to go pick her up, and Abigail is really, really upset about this. And John is upset about this as well. You've brought your daughter over, and you have not come to get her yourself. And she's heartbroken, which is an interesting thing. We'll talk a little bit about that in the book, about why Jefferson didn't go to get her. But it's an interesting point about his personality. In any event, so Sally Hemings comes to Paris, and the two of them, the brother and sister, are reunited there. They have a completely different life than they would have had at Monticello. They're paid wages. This is the first time Jefferson has paid enslaved people wages, and they're paid very good wages, as a matter of fact. When I was working on the book, I sent these wage tables to people who study 18th century France and work, and Jefferson paid them a lot. He also paid them every month, which was interesting because in Paris, in France, you were paid once a year, at the end of the year. And sometimes, and money that you get at the end of the year is hypothetical money. It's not real money until you actually get it. But the difference between being paid a high wage and paid every month, they were in a fairly good position. France was free territory in the sense that everybody who petitioned for freedom in France during this time period, the petition was granted. So they could have petitioned for freedom. They knew that, and indeed, when Sally Hemings is about to come home, or Jefferson wants to bring them home, she doesn't want to go. Now, at some point during this time period, we don't know when, Madison Hemings said that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings began a relationship. She said she became Mr. Jefferson's concubine, and he uses that term concubine, and again, terminology. What does that mean? Some people take that to mean, concubine is akin to prostitute. Other people say, well, concubine was basically a term for a woman who lived with a man without being married, which is what this was. What term would he have used? But in any event, she doesn't want to come home, and Jefferson convinces her that she will have a good life at Monticello. Her children will be free because Virginia followed the rule partus sequitur ventrum, that is, that you were what your mother was. That was not the rule they had come over with. The rule that in England had been, you were what your father was. But you can think about how that changes the nature of slavery if the condition of slavery follows through the mother versus that of a father. You would have lots more free, mixed-race children in America than the other way. But the Virginia legislature decided, House of Burgesses, as it would have been at that time, decided to switch it to "You are what your mother was," and she knew that. So Jefferson convinces her that that's going to end in her family, that her children will be free. She would have a nice life at Monticello, and so she comes back with Jefferson. Now, she's 16 at the time, so that could be a part of it. I mean, a 16-year-old might be convinced of things. The 16-year-old probably in that time period was not like a 16-year-old today. It was interesting. I was working on this book, and my daughter was around that age, and so you're sort of thinking, what kind of judgment would a 16-year-old? But a 16-year-old would not have been thought of as a child in that time period, the way we think of a 16-year-old or a 26-year-old today, or the age keeps going up, 30-year-old teenagers, wouldn't have been thought of as a child. The age of consent in Virginia was 12. It was actually 10, and they raised it to 12 in the 1820s. So they had a different understanding about things than we did. But in any event, so she comes home, and that ends the second part of the book. And the third part of the book really is about life at Monticello among all the other members of the Hemings family. Sally Hemings obviously comes back into play. Their children come back into play. Beverly, who's an eldest, it was a boy, William Beverly, Harriet, James Madison Hemings, and Thomas Eston Hemings. All of these are people who, named for people who are connected to Jefferson in some fashion. And we talk about that. I talk about that in the book. And sort of detail their lives as much as it can be ascertained, and a good amount can be ascertained about what happened to them there at Monticello in this third part of the book. The book ends with the story of the Fawcett family, which is also, they're members of the Hemings family. Joe Fawcett was a grandson of Elizabeth Hemings. He was a blacksmith at Monticello, and the head of the blacksmith shop at Monticello. And he's one of the 5 men that Jefferson freed in his will. Jefferson freed the 2 older Hemings children, Beverly and Harriet, informally. They wanted to live as white people. So in 1822, they left and went to Washington, D.C., and they have sort of disappeared from the record because they never received free papers. They just disappeared. And because there's no paper trail, we don't really know who they are. Every once in a while, someone pops up and claims to be a descendant of Harriet. There was a woman in Charlottesville who claimed to be one of the Tsar Nicholas's children, Anastasia. So it's somewhat like that. People come along, and we really don't think that these people are actually descendants, but there are definitely people out there who are descendants. We just don't know who they are. Madison and Eston are freed in Jefferson's will, along with 3 of their uncles, and they live in Charlottesville with their mother until her death in 1835. She is not formally freed. She is informally freed. She is what they call it, given their time. And people ask me about, why didn't he free her? We can talk a little bit about that too in the 10 minutes. But there are reasons for that may not be satisfactory to people today. But in the end, all of the children go free. After Sally Hemings dies, Madison and Eston move to Ohio and live their lives. One person lives as a black person, the other one lives as white, Eston does. But I end with the Fawcett family because I think their family exemplifies really the dual nature of the Hemings family's life at Monticello. They are enslaved people, but they suffered all the possible insecurities that existed for slave people. Joe Fawcett is freed, but his children are not. His wife is not freed, and he asks members of the Charlottesville community to purchase members of his family, and he promises to purchase them back. He will work and save money and purchase them, which he does. Except his youngest son, Peter Fawcett, who was sold at age 11 on the auction block at Monticello, after Monticello had to be sold because Jefferson died in debt, the person who owned him would not sell him back to his parents. They refused. he kept trying to get them to do it, and they would not do it. And eventually, the Fawcett family moves to Ohio, Cincinnati, and Joseph Fawcett begins to make a place for himself there. There is something of a happy ending. After many years, Peter Fawcett is able to buy his freedom. He joins his family in Ohio. He becomes a prominent minister and a caterer. And we know all of this because when he dies, there are two very large obituaries of him in Cincinnati newspapers, and they talk about his life. He also gave an interview about life at Monticello before he died. And I end with this story because it shows, I think, the resilience of family and the importance of family in the African American community, that they never lost faith in one another, in their thought that they would be together, their hopes that they would be together, and they worked to make this happen. Nevertheless, it indicates the problem. It shows you that as privileged as the Hemings family was, if you want to call them that, if you can even use that term to describe a person in slavery, nevertheless, they suffered the pain of separation and the pain of loss. The Hemings family, the resilience that they showed, the Fawcett showed, and other members of the family, I think is, sometimes that kind of thing is offered to as if people think that it makes slavery okay. There's nothing that can make slavery okay, to have a triumphant story at the end. But I didn't want to end with Sally Hemings and her children, because they actually end up free many decades before other African American people, other 4 million African American people were freed after the Civil War. So for them, there was something of a victory is too strong a word to say, but there was a good outcome for them. The downside is that it required, in some ways, American racism, or their response to American racism, required the loss of their family. Because Beverly and Harriet, as I mentioned to you, disappeared. They kept in contact with Madison Hemings and their brothers in Eston for a time, but then they lost contact. Eston Hemings decided, living out in Ohio, that things had become too bad. At some point, Ohio began to crack down on African Americans. And his children, he wanted a future for his children, and he didn't think that he could do that and remain black. So the family, he took his family and moved to Wisconsin, changed his name to E.H. Jefferson, Eston Hemings Jefferson. You can see it in the census. When they're in Virginia, it's, Eston Hemings and, his wife Julia Hemings and his children John Wales Jefferson Hemings and so forth. When they get to Wisconsin, the next census, the names are all different. They are living as white people. Members of the community apparently accept them as white people, even though they know when you say people pass for white, it doesn't mean necessarily that they actually look 100% white, because the person described Eston Hemings as light bronzed color with and this is the phrase he used, visible admixture of Negro blood. And he used visible admixture because that was the legal standard. You could look at a person and see that they looked black, then they were considered black. Virginia had a fractional law. It was if you were 1/8 black, you could be considered white, which was different than the one-drop rule. So in other words, during Jefferson's time, it was the standard for being white was less stringent than it was in the 20th century, or after when Virginia and other states began to adopt the sort of one-drop rule. So Ohio went to the visible admixture standard, and Eston moved to Wisconsin and made a life for himself as a white man. His son, John Wales Jefferson, was a lieutenant colonel in the Union Army. Madison Hemings' children were soldiers in the Union Army, and Jefferson's legal grandson, George Wythe Randolph, was the Secretary of the Confederacy. So here's this story, and there's going to be a volume 2 of the Hemings family that talks about the line of these lines of families, the difference between being white. One group says we're white, another group says we're black, and their different fortunes based upon that particular decision. And all of this starts back in, the 1830s when Elizabeth Hemings is born, the child of an Englishman and an African woman who becomes the mistress, concubine, whatever, rape victim, some people insist on saying, of John Wales, has 6 children, marries into Thomas Jefferson's family, and helps to shape life at Monticello. And one of the things that I talk about my co-author and I, Peter Onuf, talk about in our new book, Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, is how the Hemings family shaped Jefferson's attitudes about slavery and how his time in France resulted in a shift in his attitude. So this is a continuing process. I hope, to be back in this venue for the rest of my life, doing various incarnations of this story that is endlessly fascinating by a man who's endlessly fascinating. And whether they take him off the Jefferson-Jackson dinner thing or not, whatever they do, there's no way to take him out of history. There is no American history without Thomas Jefferson, and I think people should understand that. People do understand that and keep that in mind. So thank you very, very much. I'm supposed to... I'm supposed to tell you so that you can be recorded. Anybody who has questions should come to the mic, and please don't be afraid to do that. I'm going to make John Meacham come if nobody comes to ask me a question.
Okay.
Yes.
The caricature of Jefferson that emerges in the popular imagination is of a slave owner who imposed himself on a young slave girl who had no choice. Mm-hmm. I, at least in reading your book, got the impression this was a much more complex relationship and that these were two people who may have actually genuinely loved each other and that in another time or place may well have wanted to have a life together. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, usually that question comes at the end of all these things, and I've had a chance to think about it for a time. It's a very, very tough subject. There's no question that once Sally Hemings comes back to Virginia, she's totally under the control of Thomas Jefferson and under Virginia law. The one thing I talk about in the book, I was trying to make sense of Madison Hemings's recollections and his story of his family. He tells the story of his mother and father that suggests that these people entered into what he uses the term treaty. Now, people say, well, how's that possible? Because he's a slave owner and she's enslaved, but they're not in Virginia. They're in a place where the law was on her side and where Jefferson thought the law was on her side. There's a letter he writes to a person who says, he's essentially saying, he writes to a guy who has brought a slave to France and says, what can I do? And Jefferson basically says, if they find out that they're the law here, there's nothing that can be done. So, to my mind, it's not right to invoke Virginia law to suggest what happened in France, because both parties understood that the law was on her side, and he felt that he had to make promises to her in order to get her to come back. That is not the typical situation that happened in Virginia, that happened across the South in America. Most slaves would not have had that kind of opportunity unless you say, the thing that's uncomfortable to me is to make it sound as if a person who is born enslaved necessarily acts the same no matter where they are, even when they're in free territory, even when they know they have that they have the chance for freedom, even when they have money, even when they're lawyers in that place who do pro bono work to file these petitions. It's just not the same. I don't feel comfortable treating them the same way. And so that's why I have a discussion in the book. That's one of the reasons the book is long, because you can't, these are not simple things, and you have to go through and explain. Sure, it's possible that they loved each other. It's possible that she wanted to come home to be with her family. I mean, this is one dilemma. You think about this. Think about it from all angles. One of the reasons enslaved people didn't run away, you think about, would you like to be free without the rest of your family? What would it be like to live in France with just your brother? Because I think her brother was in on this as well. Before he leaves, just in the months before he's supposed to leave, well, I guess the year before he's supposed to leave, he hires a man to teach him French, proper French, which doesn't sound like somebody who thinks he's going back to the United States. And indeed, after he comes back and Jefferson frees him, he travels back. James Hemings travels back to Europe. So I think it's a complicated situation, and I understand people who take the position that any kind of contact between a master and an enslaved woman is rape, that it's the equivalent of statutory rape, but we can't use the law because the law, I mean, in law wouldn't recognize rape. The rape of an enslaved woman by somebody other than a master was a trespass, so people didn't even recognize that. But we know that there's something called rape that exists outside of law. But I think the power, the opportunities that she had there make the question much more complicated than people typically think it is, and that's what I want to show. It's not just a caricature of it's not an edict that applies to every situation. Listen.
Hi, James Ellis, who follows you, is one of those.
Joe.
Most historians think that there was a sexual relationship between Sally Hemings and Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson. James Ellis, and I guess maybe another minority, think that it was actually Jefferson's 12-year younger brother that had the sexual relationship with Sally Hemings. Could you explain?
Well, here's what happened. Randolph Jefferson is Jefferson's brother, younger brother, who appears on the scene November 2nd, 1998, after the DNA test came back. All of the people before had insisted that it was one of Jefferson's nephews. Once the DNA came back and ruled the Carr brothers out, the same people who had been saying that it was the nephews all of a sudden bring up Randolph Jefferson. But there's nothing in the historical record to support that. And one of the I think I'm going to write a book. I want to write a book, or no, it could be an article, and I would call it Damage. And I would go through and see all of the people whose lives and reputations have been wrecked in service of trying to save Jefferson. First, it was Peter Carr, who was married. Peter Carr was a married man. And historians insisted that he was the father of Sally Hemings' children. We know nothing about that. Sam Carr was a married man. Randolph Jefferson was married during some of the time that Sally Hemings was having children, was not married. He was in between wives, because wives died in those days, and husbands died too. But again, you're accusing somebody, married men, of having long-term relationships with women, and there's no evidence. I mean, history has to be based on things that people indicate, their indications during the time period that something happened, but there's nothing there. I mean, Randolph actually appears the day the DNA results came back. And someone who had written to me before saying it's going to be the Carrs, that same next day I get an email saying it must have been Randolph Jefferson or Isham Jefferson or someone other Jefferson. So yeah, it will never be, I just don't think it will ever be resolved in the minds of some people because they just don't want it. And if people don't want something, it's not going to happen. So I don't know what else to say except for history. We have to look back at the time period and see the connections. What are the connections between Randolph Jefferson and Sally Hemings? And we don't have that. We just don't.
I'm terribly sorry. We're going to have to cut questions off so we can keep us. Please,
Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.